Hello and welcome to our special edition of Tech That Talks, where I have the pleasure of speaking alongside the experts of various focal points of data privacy legislations that will come together with one goal: to define the data privacy trends for 2022 and what to watch out for. So where do the current data privacy legislations in the US lie? How are consumers being protected? And what are consumers focusing on when it comes to their privacy involving, let's say, smart devices, or more specifically, devices or apps that cater to children? We will get to all of these questions and more. And like every Tech That Talks, please use the question section on your control panel to ask any questions that you may have. But first, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself and our panelists. For those of you who are new to Tech That Talks, my name is Jessica Benny. I'll be your host today, and alongside the three experts, we will be discussing the most pressing issues in children's privacy and consumer rights. First, we have Justin Brookman, Director of Consumer Privacy and Technology Policy, Consumer Reports, and Baroness Bevan Kidron, Founder and Chair of Five Rights Foundation, and also a movie director. Maybe she'll tell us a little bit more about that as well. So thank you all for being here today, and let's get started. We have Senator Marston as well. I see popping in.
There we go. How you doing?
Senator, happy belated birthday.
Well, thanks. Yeah, well, they're not so happy when you get to my age, but you know.
Hey, birthday's a birthday.
You live with it.
Well, thank you very much for being here today. And Senator Marston, let's start with you. So I'd like to open up our discussion with a more general question on data privacy right now, and to explain to our viewers where the current state of US privacy legislation lies, and maybe an update from the last time we spoke last year.
Okay. As you know, California was the first to pass a state-based data privacy, which was I don't know how to describe it. I guess, you know, it certainly had some good features, but it was overly complex, overly burdensome, difficult to enforce. Just had a lot of problems. So the state of Washington took it on with the help of the folks at Amazon, and they came up with a template, a model, if you will. But they couldn't get it through their legislature, predominantly because of the influence of trial lawyers in key positions within the Washington state legislature. Trial lawyers are ones who don't sort of believe in data privacy laws. They would just rather sue and sue for damages when people's data privacy is abused. And but we adopted their model to a certain extent, made some changes to it, and it became the first really workable and popular data privacy law in the United States. It's been duplicated in several states now, other states, and other states are certainly looking at it, and they're pretty much adopting what we did in Virginia. And we made several changes this year to the law. We cleaned up where the money for any fines or penalties for data privacy violations, where that's to go in our Attorney General's office. We put close to $500,000 into the Attorney General's office to staff the office that will deal with data privacy. And we made a couple of fundamental changes. One, we exempted political databases from the law. In other words, what happens is in the United States is that we go to our voter files, and politicians and campaigns for politicians get the data on who votes and where they live and who they are and what have you, which is exempt as it is, as the law was originally written. But then again, what happens is we take that data and we populate it with information based on canvassing at doors and things like that, and identifying who's a strong Democrat, who's a strong Republican, who's an independent, that type of thing. And then that information gets sold. So we had to make clear that that was also not subject to the data privacy law. We cleaned up where the money was to go, as I said, in the Attorney General's office. And we made two other exemptions. One is, for instance, if you're a company and you have been asked to get rid of somebody's data, they say, we don't want you to have our data, so please delete it. Well, this is a company like LexisNexis, for instance, who goes out and they acquire data on an almost continuing basis. And suppose they reacquire that person's data that they've already been asked to delete. And so the law, the change we made this year made it clear that you could continue to delete that data. You can keep just enough on file to know that you need to continually do that. And that is okay. You don't have to go back out to the consumer every time. And the other change we made was to one nonprofit organization who deals with assisting the federal government with fraud cases. If you're being investigated for fraud and they're keeping a file on you, you should not be subject to having the person who's being investigated call up and say, please delete my data. When you're under investigation for fraud and they're holding information about you. So those were the changes we made this year, and that's the status on the law. And so I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Senator, for all of these insights. And you're talking a lot about the bill being amended and the Virginia Act being amended. There are 7 bills, correct me if I'm wrong, that amended the Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act. And how could you zoom in a little bit more specifically? How is this supposed to provide a more comprehensive privacy framework for Virginia and the US? More specifically, what does this mean for businesses?
Well, what we're trying to do is to create protections for people, certainly so that they can have their data, corrected, deleted, all of those kinds of things that we had in the original act. But what we're trying to do is to not be overly burdensome for businesses, which is why we made some of the changes I just talked about to not overly hinder businesses that are sort of unique in their nature, and for like organizations that continually reacquire somebody's data, they need to know how to deal with protecting that privacy for those individuals. So we're trying to find that balance, and you will find people who you've not gone far enough on data privacy, and then you'll have business interests who say, well, you've gone way, way too far. But our whole economy now, worldwide and here in the United States, is based on the exchange of data. Sometimes it's annoying. Sometimes it's you're looking to buy a home, and all of a sudden that perfect home is have you looked at this? And somebody has sent you that data and you go, hot damn, that's great. Other times it's, no, I don't want to buy a new garbage disposal. I don't care how free it is. Stop sending me information about garbage disposals. And so you try to hit that balance. It is an imperfect world that we live in. And our job as legislators is to try to create a balance that protects rights, but at the same time doesn't overly hinder our business environment, but gets at the folks who are abusers and gives people the right to turn off that use of their data that they find inappropriate.
I agree, because data still needs to be used for good, especially in let's say more health related fields. And Justin will also get to you in terms of what the Consumer Reports is doing. And we can't really hinder innovation when it comes to this. So thank you so much for that, Senator. And Justin, I'd like to move on to you in Consumer Reports. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you guys are doing right now in terms of data privacy, where your focus point lies? And maybe we can talk about the juicy things such as applications, mobile apps, Internet of Things.
Sure. So Consumer Reports, we have a couple different pieces of the organization. One, we have the rating services, which a lot of folks know about, evaluating what's the best car and what's the best TV, but increasingly evaluating those services on data privacy and security as well. So smart TVs can also, they have a bright screen, but also they can watch what you watch. And so we're trying to give scores based on how good a job they do at protecting privacy and security. And then I'm on the advocacy side. And so a lot of what we do is argue for better protections at the federal and increasingly the state level. Federal legislation we fought for for decades, nothing's really advanced. And then suddenly we have seen these advent of state laws, including in Virginia. So I think most of our work has been on state privacy legislation. I agree with Senator Marsden. The California law definitely confusingly written. It was written super quickly. But I think the sort of provisions in there, I think are, and including in the Virginia law too, are really like the lowest hanging fruit. Like this is like the bare minimum companies should be doing. Like you should make your information accessible to folks. You should give the folks the ability to delete it if they don't need to have it. Most of these bills are, you call them opt-out based. You can go out of your way to say, no, knock off selling my information. I do worry that in practice, that's really hard to use. I mean, is it practical to scroll down to the bottom of every single website and say, you don't sell my data? And then you open a new page, let's scroll down to the bottom of the website, you don't sell my information. And so, we've seen in California, which Senator Marsden criticizes as overly onerous, like they're just not usable. No, consumers can't practically do that. And so, I think the Virginia law has some very good elements, and I think is a good start. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not going to like fundamentally change the data behaviors that we're concerned about, companies collecting and selling and sharing data in maybe adversarial ways. So I think we've been exploring pushing either global opt-outs where you can tell all those websites all at once, none of y'all, I don't want any of y'all selling my data, or just maybe prohibiting some of these practices. Like maybe we don't want to be inundated with garbage disposal ads 24/7. Maybe if I go to a shopping website, they should be prohibited from selling my data to data brokers to inundate me. So that's a lot, that's definitely a lot of what we do. Also work with federal regulators as well, ultimately trying to get some incrementally better protections for consumers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Justin. And in a recent article, I recently read that researchers have discovered that apps certified under the Safe Harbor program, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that, are no better and maybe even worse than those that are not certified under this program. Is this true? The statement is rightly so concerning, but should there be reason to worry?
Yeah, and I'm not sure of that article. COPPA, which is the Kids Privacy Protection Act, does have a safe harbor program, but I think it widely is criticized as not providing a lot of extra benefit. You pay someone, yeah, look at me, and see if I'm COPPA certified. Ultimately, COPPA's got a lot of loopholes in it, and so it's not at all surprising that companies under that safe harbor program, which, like I said, has been widely criticized. First of all, it's the companies who are maybe the ones on the borderline who are more likely to want to get safe harbor to make sure they're not going to get in trouble. Ultimately, also, they're the ones paying the bills, right? I'm the one, here's $50,000. I need you to look at my information. I think the incentives are skewed such that they're not going to do maybe the most thorough job. Similarly, there are some bills that require you to pay an auditor or buy an auditor, and I don't think those really move the needle. And so we tend to be pretty skeptical of the value of safe harbor programs in the law. Really, the law should just say what you should do and what you should not do, and it should be clear. And I think Senator Marsden is right. Like there are privacy laws that are unclear, and I think that is a problem and a legitimate concern for business. But if the law ultimately says what you should do and what you shouldn't do, then I think the safe harbor programs don't really have a role to play.
And are we looking at certain like dark traces, dark patterns in terms of data privacy collection and what companies use as, let's say, a data privacy strategy? Can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, dark patterns is definitely a concern. Certainly, we've seen some more efforts to go to a more consent model, right? Get consumers' consent before you do stuff with data. Well, then like the companies who get to design that interface can test like 8,000 different iterations and find the ones that you're more likely to click on. So, I think folks in Europe are used to cookie consent screens. When you go to a website, a giant thing flashes up and there's like a big flashing OK button, and then maybe in the corner there's like light gray skip button, or you hit like more information and you get like 8,000 choices, and folks are just gonna be like, no, I just don't have the chance to deal with that. It isn't really, because ultimately, if someone really wants that sort of thing, you want to empower them to choose to have their data shared. But I feel like 9 times out of 10, because the companies are the ones that design the interfaces, it's going to be manipulative and abusive and maybe deceptive and illegal. There was a report when GDPR came out, and like big companies like Google and Facebook forced all their users through all these new screens, and people were like, okay, I don't know. And buried in the fine print, they're like, by the way, we're going to collect everything you do on every other website and use it for ads. And folks didn't really understand what was going on. The Norwegian Consumer Council actually has a really extensive report kind of annotating each step along the way in the process. It's really hard. Regulators don't have the ability and time to micromanage every interface. And so I think we are seeing legislation increasingly calling out dark patterns, though it's obviously nothing new. I mean, advertisers have been trying to put their thumb on the scale for centuries. But it's something that I think that regulators are going to have to be a little bit more aggressive on to curtail some of these worst practices.
Mm-hmm. And maybe technology is also going to have to adopt itself into that. So our company, the company that I work for, User-Centrics, makes one of those consent management platforms that you just talked about. And we're also pivoting now into smart devices, smart TVs, specifically mobile apps. And we're seeing, though, in Europe that a couple companies are very hesitant and don't necessarily see the need for a tool like that when it comes to their smart devices. Do you see this as a problem as well as in the US? What can be done against this?
Yeah, I do worry about relying on too much on consent, again, because folks don't want to have to make detailed privacy choices every website they go to. They just kind of want it to work. I just want to read this. I just want to see this box score, how the Braves did. I just want to read this news story. I think I personally don't think it's a good trend when consent screens for every site, every service. I don't want to have to walk into a store and have to make 18 privacy choices when I check out to buy the garbage disposal, which I was convinced to buy. I think it's a better result if companies just don't do a lot of these bad practices. The problem is there's just no accountability for it. You don't really know what happens. When you go to a website, you don't see your data being shared with 50, 100, 150 different companies. You don't see if they're using bad data security, because how are you supposed to evaluate that? And so I think companies can get away with a lot of nonsense and not be held accountable for it. So I think law is ultimately going to be a little bit more prescriptive, not put all the onus on the user to try to manage their settings, because even Facebook, the one company, if you go to try to manage your Facebook privacy settings, it's a nightmare. It's incredibly difficult. They list 8,000 companies who have uploaded your data to them, and you have to count one by one, say, not this guy, not this dude, who are these people? Really difficult to manage, and I think it puts too much onus on the user.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true. Thank you so much, Justin. And looking at the fact where you keep on talking about trust as well, what or how much does trust have a role to play in terms of creating a proper data privacy strategy? So if you're saying, okay, consumers and companies should not be asking for so much data, they should be collecting better data, how does the user trust in the company that they're actually just collecting what they say they're going to be collecting without then going through the privacy policies and scrolling down and reading?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's definitely tricky today. If you're buying a LG versus a Samsung smart refrigerator, right? It's really hard to make an informed choice. Which one's going to sell information about how much fruit I have in there, or whether I'm, or whether I have all processed.
Which one's being honest in the transparency on privacy policy?
Yeah, I don't want to have to read my smart fridge privacy policy. That's just mean to. I mean, that's what I do this for, like a hobby, and I don't want to have to do that sort of thing. We, like I said, we're trying to experiment with providing ratings, and so Consumer Reports will say which one keeps your food the coolest, and which one lasts the longest, and which one has the coolest ice interface. Trying to give more scores on privacy and security as well, though it's really hard. It's even for experts who spend hours and hours reading the policies and trying to find out what happens. It's really difficult. Plus, with one software update, a flip of a switch, suddenly their behaviors changed wildly differently, and they're doing something completely differently. So I think without legislation, without a law saying yes, you can trust your smart fridge, is really difficult for consumers to trust. Maybe there's a place for seals and for certifications and for companies that go above and beyond. Maybe companies can, maybe there should be some kind of label saying, this on security, right? For example, we have no idea how long any smart device is going to get security updates for. Your smartphone, iPhones get updates forever. Some Android phones do, some Android phones don't, but a smart TV, you have no expectations for how long that will last, how long it'll get software updates, how long it'll get security updates. And so maybe that's the sort of thing that a label or like a energy seal can say, hey, this will be supported for 6 years. You can trust this device, this smart fridge will last for 10 years. Maybe that helps in the margins, but I really think we need legislation to set norms for people.
And stronger fines probably as well, so that people will actually take legislation seriously. Thank you, Justin. Thank you very much. I also wanted to take our focus point and now focus a little bit more on children and children's data privacy, especially when we're talking about smart devices and mobile applications, which is something that children use a lot. So Baroness Kidron, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this. Connected toys have long been a concern for security professionals who argue that while they do offer certain features, they often lack the built-in security measures that children need in order to protect their privacy rights. This makes it for easy targets. And what can you tell us about the current state of legislation for children's privacy? Let's start with the US. I know that you were in the US right now advocating for children's privacy, but also in the UK, of course, where Five Rights is located.
Sorry,
We can't hear you.
that old trick. So thank you very much. And I think maybe I'm going to break out an agreement with the previous speakers on a number of different issues here. I think if I can just step back before I answer your question directly, is just say one thing that strikes me is that this conversation always takes place in the sort of cloud of exceptionality that the tech sector have created for themselves, and the idea that they are different from other businesses and their different rules apply and so on. And I think that it is very helpful to me, especially when thinking about children, but sort of even as a citizen, to think about what my expectations of companies are, and consumer-facing companies. So, for example, if you think about medicine, they have to test their products before they send it out, and indeed give a different dose to children, or maybe even a different medicine to a child because of their size or difference in physical development. Or if you think about the car sector, we do not accept a car being sold, hired, or driven without brakes and an airbag and a rear view mirror. Yeah. And so if you start with that premise, that some of the things that really strike us, and sort of roll back this idea of exceptionality and say, this is actually an organizing technology of the world. We all have to interact with it, whether we choose to or not at this point. And particularly, I would say, in terms of children, they do not feel, and I do not see the choice. So if it's not optional, it has to be designed in there, for their use. They have to use it at school. They're kicked out of classes if they won't go on Google Classroom. I've seen that happen around the world, Europe and here. Parents who say, no, I don't like the privacy settings of that thing. But actually it's the kid who gets ejected, not Google Classroom, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that if we just sort of accept that it's grown up sort of in this sort of incredible way with a focus on them being different, but actually we as consumers and children as in particular, have to relate to these things. And if it's not optional, they have to play by our rules. So to your precise point, I think that in Europe, we've developed a slightly different approach, but it actually speaks to many of the things that both the other speakers have said. And, it speaks to the fact that you have to put the responsibility upstream. These things can't be dealt with just only on consent, fiddling around at the bottom of your screen, or 3 clicks later, or indeed 6 clicks later, is not really an option for a real person having a real relationship with technology. So the work that I've been doing is really around a couple of concepts. First of all, that a child is a person under 18. That's actually how it is stated in the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And whilst the US is not a signatory, 196 countries around the world are, and the US prides itself on abiding by the convention, even though they're not signed to it. And I think that's really important, because a lot of the risks and problems of the digital world happen to children 14, 15, 16. In fact, we know it happens to that age group more than any other between the hours of 10 and 12 at night. So it's like we really know where the problem is, and if we don't actually put something in place for those kids, then actually we're leaving them, you know, the most vulnerable kids, you know, in the most vulnerable situation. The other sort of concept, and this is very much I'm the author of, but it has been now taken around Europe, is this idea of likely to be accessed. And this is actually a direct challenge to COPPA, which has created, I think, a false world in which a 13-year-old is treated as an adult. And that's very, very problematic for their privacy, because actually children, you know, and for marketing and for all sorts of things that I'm sure we'll get to in this conversation. But basically any parent, anybody who's been a child knows that they weren't adults at 13, period. Yeah. Now that isn't to say that a 5-year-old needs the same protections as a 17-year-old. Yeah, absolutely not. And that there is a sort of a journey of agency and a journey of maturity that has to be acknowledged. But it does actually absolutely mean that a 17-year-old should have some privacy privileges because they are yet an adult. So that's one thing. And then the last thing is this idea by design and default, you know, that actually the flaw, yeah, and I really do agree with Senator Marsden, you know, this is not a perfect world we're going for. Yeah, I don't see a perfect world in any context. So why would we expect the digital to be immediately perfect? We don't. But I think that the flaw is, you know, the idea of raising the floor, you know, is quite an important idea. So that as Justin says, there are some things that just shouldn't be allowed. Yeah, there are some things that should be mitigated depending on who the end user is. Yeah, and there are some things that you should be aware of. Yeah, and so it may be that it's mitigated, managed, banned, whatever, different things depending on what that interaction is. But we're not saying that any company should not be better than that. Not saying that any company couldn't make different decisions. And I think that is where we have come up with a set of principles and a set of practices, and they are not as prescriptive as they are outcome based. And they go, the outcome we expect is based on these principles, yeah, and they are privacy enhancing principles. And if you don't meet that outcome, you can meet it any way you like technologically, yeah. But if you don't meet it, then the regulator does have a hand. And again, I agree with both other speakers that the regulator has to have some power. Otherwise, this will not happen. And again, we can look back on this, but we did some research about what companies are doing to protect consumers. And it's in direct proportion to the amount of law that is in place. Yeah, so they're doing a lot more on privacy because there's a lot more privacy law. They immediately, we got modern slavery law in the UK, they started doing that. But on the things that are voluntary, they're not doing it. So all of that sort of is sort of embodied in for kids in the age appropriate design code. And I think maybe I should just say very briefly that some of the actions that we've seen as a result of that are things like TikTok turning off notifications through the night. And they did it for 15-year-olds. They stopped at 9 p.m. and 17-year-olds, they stopped at 10 p.m., showing that they can make a bit of a difference. Google put safe search by automatically, and YouTube turned off autoplay. Both Instagram and TikTok stopped introducing strange adults to children. And those are the reason that I say that, that I think it is really interesting that the logic of the provisions in the code push the companies to think, if the end user was a child, you know, what would I do differently for the privacy regime? And perhaps I can finish by saying, you know, the relationship between the features of a service and their privacy regime is so intense that actually data protection turns out to be a very, very good way of not only making children private, but actually making them safer. And so it's a really interesting correlation that I think people are only just beginning to understand. why is it that you would turn off autoplay? You know, why is it better for kids to have autoplay? We would just talk about dark patterns. We talk about the attention economy. We talk about, you know, actually, because one of the provisions of the bills is don't nudge a child to create, you know, a lesser privacy. And again, that speaks to some of the things that Justin was saying. So maybe I should stop there. We are trying to bring this into California. It's a bipartisan effort. They absolutely have my support, California, in doing it. I agree with Justin. It'd be great to see something in Washington, but it has not been forthcoming. And I do think that there is a intrinsic problem about going state by state, but I would say this is something that is already in the UK. They're already doing globally. And so it is actually building a consensus, you know, of how to approach it internationally. And I think that that is a very important thing. And really, what was surprising to everybody, I think, was that when they started to make changes, they rolled them out globally. But now the UK is in this bizarre position of being the only place that can interpret the law. Yeah, because we've got the only piece of compliance. So I am quite desperate, and I have to say, I am expecting movement across Europe, in Canada, let's hope California, and in Australia. But I am quite desperate that others join in so that together we can determine the flaw, rather than the UK becomes this sort of, you know, ridiculous policeman of child online privacy, which would be, I think, possibly undemocratic, but certainly not a good outcome from my point of view.
How is Europe coming along as well with children's privacy? Is the UK seen as kind of the beacon of truth here, or at the forefront of children's privacy legislations?
So I would never, I mean, I'd never claim beacon of truth, but I have to say that just like Washington, Europe has been for years, a decade, saying, oh, whoops, we must have children's privacy. So let's not call ourselves a beacon, let's call us a first mover. Yeah, we got something over the line. We've got something very, very impactful over the line. And I think what's really been interesting for me is the tens of millions of dollars that are going into redesigning platforms. So I would say three very rapid things. First of all, this is great for kids. Yeah. Second of all, yes, Europe is now looking at it and working towards expecting to have a kids' privacy regime within the next 18 months, and Ireland has already copied the code. And for those of you who are in this space will know Ireland is particularly important because it's the one-stop shop for data protection. So Ireland's already copied it very, very closely. But I think the big and important thing for all of us in this space is that actually, you know, here we can see evidence that the sector is 100% designed. It's man and woman made. Yeah, it can be optimized for any purpose, and we're seeing it being optimized for children's privacy and safety. And that has to be a fantastic lesson to all of us, and a fantastic kind of fillip to us who are trying to get a broader settlement for citizens. Yeah, that actually society can be in conversation with tech, and society can impose some values on tech about how we wish to be treated and how we wish it to play out. And I say this as someone who is completely, you know, tech positive, want this in the world, want kids online. You know, I'm not interested in blocking and banning. I just want it to be kinder, better, safer, more private. And that is the journey that the Age Appropriate Design Code is. It's sort of, I'd say it isn't a tiny step, it's a big, giant step, but it is only a step. And for that, you know, to make it the road traveled, we need other parts of the world to follow.
Thank you, Baroness Kidron. And I have a question. This concept of playful by design, you said right now that millions of dollars are needed and are actually being used in order to change the technology behind certain platforms. Is that what playful by design encompasses?
So I think I said safety by design, but I'm really thrilled that you said playful by design, because we did a piece of research which is on playful by design. And it's really talking about, I think that a lot of the conversation around kids sort of becomes about safety. And I think that from a 5 rights point of view and from a personal point of view, I want it to be about agency. Yeah. And one of the things that's really gone out of a lot of children's lives as they spend more and more time online, partly because of the, the fear of parents, of the real world, blah, 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 lots of other things that sit outside of the context of this discussion, is a sort of a loss of free play. And so we did some research last year led by Sonia Livingston, Professor Sonia Livingston from the LSE. And it was really about trying to articulate what features companies need to embed in their products to leave children sort of freedom of thought and some autonomous places to play. And playful by design is the outcome of that. And you will have seen a big announcement last week from Lego, who've done a deal, with one of the big gaming companies, and they have committed to children's privacy per the code, and also this playful by design concept that we put together. So I really think that we are interested in children's autonomy. And one of the biggest fears that I have is that if we don't get the companies to design appropriately for children, and again, I stress that is not 100% safe, that is appropriately, not dangerously, not riskily, not pushing them into behaviors and states that are not warranted, that I worry that the end result will be a lot of very, very poor decisions about, slamming parental controls, pushing up the age, pulling them offline, and sort of not dealing with the problem at a fundamental level, but actually putting protections in that are actually not in children's best interest. So I think that is a struggle, because that is a nuanced argument. Everybody's very keen to protect children. They're less keen to give them agency and to give them and to put them in an environment, that is, and when I say suitable, I don't mean walled garden, I mean in which they can make reasonable decisions. And possibly worth saying that all of the companies have put in sort of breaks and automatic timeouts and well-being and as a result of the code. I mean, that's the least of it, but it does make it less toxic as a user. And I think we've all experienced it ourselves, which is if it keeps on coming, we're still there, right? If it actually breaks or something interrupts or, it stops naturally, you have moments in which you can disengage. But I don't want to say it's about time on, time off. It's not. I think the screen time argument is a total red herring. If you want to be, creating your opus in music for 12 hours a day as a kid, please carry on. That's a fantastic thing to be doing. It's about pulling kids into very commercial spaces in order to take their data, in order to grow your business, in order to take their attention, in order to sell their attention. That is the bit we're dealing with. We're not dealing with time online.
Very interesting insight. Thank you very much. And that's also where the concept playful by design then makes more sense. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the FGC also, one of their main points that they're pushing in terms of children's privacy is that parents give their consent, correct? For when underage children use applications and use online technologies. Do you think that this is enough? Is this a smart way to go about handling children's privacy? And how can this really be proven that a person over 18 has given the consent for someone else?
Listen, I do think consent has a place to play in certain sort of particular circumstances, particularly around sensitive data, like do I want my NHS data to be shared with researchers for the purposes of curing cancer? Very possibly I do, if they're not going to make a deal with DeepMind, So yeah, there are places where consent has a role, but fundamentally, I put my colors on the table. Fundamentally, I think consent is decades old at this point. It's the wrong way. Yeah, it's the wrong way of thinking about it. And I think that you only need to spend 60 seconds thinking about one's own behavior to you know, as Justin's already said, to think about whether consent is operable. You know, it's a bit like saying, it's a bit like saying, you know, let's have clearer terms and conditions. You know, I'm like Justin, we share a hobby, which is reading terms and conditions. I can tell you it puts us in less than 2% of the adult population. Yeah. And I think that 2% actually also represents a great many lawyers who are doing it for professional reasons. So, I mean, nobody's reading this stuff. Yeah, nobody. And therefore it's not effective. And the same thing with consent. And I just want to make this point sort of about kids in particular. You know, absolutely, you know, there's a role for parental controls and parental oversight for very young children. You know, absolutely would not take anything away from that. But, you know, parents generally work, they generally sleep, they often have to make dinner. Not all kids have engaged parents. Not all kids have parents who are tech savvy, and not all kids have parents. And I don't, you know, and I sort of challenge anyone on this call to want their, you know, to be 17 and want their mother or father to know what they're doing. I didn't, I wouldn't. I just think it's, you know, for everybody who just wants to find a silver bullet, there isn't one. Yeah, this is a mixed economy of events in which we start with product safety and say, you know, according to the foreseeable risks, you clean up your product. Yeah, that's the regulatory bit. You know, then there comes, you know, a sort of how do you deal with it within families and within schools and within settings that we understand. And then there's some personal choice in there. And all of those things have a route to play. But if you start to think of either consent as the answer, as the structural answer, we're dead in the water. Yeah. And I give you an example, you know, which is actually not to do with kids, but it just always struck me as so clear cut, which is, you know, when you put Nest, you know, heating in your house. Yeah. If you were to agree, you in effect agree to 1,000 plus companies sharing your data. And if you don't agree, it doesn't work. And in amongst the things that you agree to by ticking, yeah, is that they can listen into your household. Well, I don't want my heater listening into my household. Yeah. And I don't want 1,000 people sharing all that data. Mm-hmm. And also I don't want to read 1,000 terms and conditions. So I think this whole idea of consent is a false god. There's not a proper choice. There's not a proper choice being offered. And therefore it is, I mean, well, let me just say it's bad. I actually think it's unfair, unjust. I actually think it's an unfair trading practice to use.
I think that, yeah, some companies
where you go for choice.
I agree. I think some companies do not use consent properly, and that's the problem where we get into dark patterns where there is no opt-out option, where people cannot even find the opt-out option, where it's not as easy. And so people just end up consenting to things that they're completely unaware of. And making a privacy policy literate and for everybody to understand is one of the main goals of GDPR. But it's just not happening and not enough. A lot of the reality is that the average Joe or you and me will not be sitting down and reading these privacy policies, and they do not understand where their data will actually be used. And I think specifically that's the case, and that's the problem when it comes to children.
I think that's why we've taken the approach we have, and the age appropriate design code does say, you know, you have to have your terms and conditions have to be clear to the age of the user, yeah, that you're likely to have. So if you've got, you know, if you've got 5-year-olds, it has to be something their parents understand. But if you've got 15-year-olds, it has to be something 15-year-old be understand. And I'm going to raise one last thing, which is sort of in a way the sort of elephant in the room, is one of the arguments immediately becomes, well, how do you know how old they are? And it's very funny because I've just done a bit of a tour of Silicon Valley, and the only people who have never asked that question are the companies, because they know exactly how old they are. And they know. It's just the responsibilities that flow from that. And I think that we have to really tackle the rules around how you gauge age, because at the moment, they are completely not transparent. They are very, very poorly addressed. They're only used for commercial purposes, i.e. they identify children for commercial purposes and then choose to ignore them for any other purpose. And they are very, very widely spread. So for example, I don't know if you know, but that if actually you log in using Facebook, one of the pieces of information they share with the next company is your age range. Yeah. So, it's so broadly done without any rules of engagement that actually I want to see something very, very radically transparent, purpose limited, issues about privacy and security to pull back that conversation to be a privacy conversation instead of a commercial free-for-all.
Thank you, Bernice. And I think that this is also going to be very complicated when we look at more futuristic technologies, future-looking technologies such as the metaverse, and when children start using these applications and these things, how will children's privacy be protected then?
Yeah,
that is also going to be a different and difficult area and space to navigate. What can parents do to protect their children's privacy online? What are as Justin was saying, there's no stamp of approval. Trust is naturally a large factor in this, but what else can be done? What tips can you perhaps give to our viewers who are watching?
Listen, I think it's really difficult. I mean, if I was being kind of ruthless, I'd say not a great deal. I mean, you should take out apps you're not using. You should set the settings. You should actually observe age limits, even if it makes you unpopular with your kids, and all of those things. But I think it's a really asymmetric fight. And I think that just think about your own use, think about our own issues, and then think about trying to determine that for someone else, and then that someone else is in a world that has pressures of their own. So I just don't think it's a fair fight. I do think that the more openness and the more you understand about not the individual services. I find that parents are very sort of kind of upset that they don't know the latest thing, but actually I always encourage them to understand tribes of services, features. So if there is direct messaging, that's something useful for a parent to understand. If there is a very, very sort of emphasis on sharing, that's important to understand. If it diverts publicly to the entire user group, i.e. 500 million people from your bedroom, that's something worth knowing. So I think there's that, but I also do encourage parents to parent and say, these are our rules, stuff it, I don't care what the tech's saying. But I want to say that we mustn't blame parents. This is not a responsibility of parents, really. That the tech has to be better. And to pick up on what you just said is, this isn't, the metaverse isn't the future. There's $10 billion a year being spent right now building the metaverse. And right now is where the privacy questions in the metaverse have to be answered. And I have raised some of those already directly, with Meta about what are they thinking, but and what I believe they should be thinking about. And it's not always the same thing, I'll be honest, but I think, really, really, I would say something slightly more dramatic, which is society must be in conversation with the sector. We must have a seat at the table, because a lot of what is coming up in the next 5 to 10 years is a sort of a distributed responsibility. And as that responsibility is distributed, it will be harder to be in conversation. So as much as all of us on this call might feel that there are a handful of powerful gatekeepers, and they are too powerful and they are too resistant to what society wants, I think if you imagine that same power distributed amongst hundreds of thousands of different things for which the gatekeepers don't take responsibility, I think that that's also very problematic. We need to be in conversation. And I think we have to also, as a community, you know, and this is something I have been saying, you know, in the UK, in Europe, from where I have some purchase, you know, and I do believe it here in America too, although I don't have the same purchase, is to say, you know, we have to get over this better is the enemy of best. Yeah, we absolutely have to get some things over the line so we can negotiate. At the moment, I see a lot of problems everywhere in all our environments where, you know, there's a fight about the last 20%. And I keep on saying to people, if we can agree about the 80, let's do that. Yeah, and then build out, because I am worried that we are fighting yesterday's battles today, and we should be fighting tomorrow's battle.
Absolutely. And that really holds when you're looking at technologies, for example, that you say the metaverse. This is what's happening now. And right now we need to pull the public sector in, the private sector in, and actually start where, for example, where the engineers are, and have them already dive deep into the data privacy strategy for any sort of software or app or company in order to actually have a proper data privacy strategy. And that's also where the concept privacy by design comes in. And that's also where our developers come in as well. We're trying to get companies to understand that this has to be now, before the technology is even out there. And that's what's going to establish a healthier data privacy strategy than for every company. I know, Baroness, that I'd spoken with a colleague of yours in terms of a study that you guys conducted in the US, I think, for companies that weren't really adhering to children's privacy, or how the legislative field looked in terms of children's privacy. Can you tell us a little bit more on that? What were the results, perhaps? What was found? And maybe Justin or Senator Marston, you can say one or two things in terms of other products and certain areas that are also not following a data privacy code.
So let me be brief, because I think I'd like to hand over to American colleagues on that question. But just briefly to say, that when the law came in, we noticed very quickly that the gaming sector was sort of going like this and thinking, oh, they're going to go over after social media first. Yeah, you know, that everybody's hiding behind everyone else. So what we did was we made a complaint to our regulator, sort of a thematic complaint about where we thought the sectors were not responding, where we thought that they were dodging some of the systemic pieces of the code, and to just sort of, as I was trying to say earlier, push the floor up. Yeah, so it is much easier for companies to do some eye-catching things than it is to respond to the standard that says you may not use a child's browsing history to offer them detrimental material as defined by public health, right? i.e., you know, self-harm, pro-suicide, you know, that sort of thing. They are starting to do it. They are in the middle of doing it. They are beginning to do it, but it's a much bigger ask because it upsets their business model and their practice. So yes, we are pushing, but I think that my last word on this would be, I see this as much as possible tech neutral. It's not about excluding anybody or focusing on anybody, but it's proportionate to the risk you create. And that's why it starts with a risk assessment, and you do your own mitigation, and then the regulator gets to judge whether it is creating, you know, whether it's complying. And I think that that is a healthy and business friendly way of doing it. It's basically product safety.
Thank you very much. Justin, would you like to add something on this, or Senator Marston?
Yeah, you know, just trying to think of novel issues. You talk about the metaverse, and I think, you know, the metaverse, you know, I think at the margins maybe has some novel issues, but, you know, ultimately I think is the same values apply. And again, we've had versions of the metaverse going back to Second Life in the mid 2000s, and so I think we can adapt. I think one piece that's interesting is the idea of augmented reality and privacy in public places. And so people who are wearing the new Facebook glasses can walk down the street and identify every person they see. Going back to the Google Glass controversy of several years ago, but I think the technology is evolving. Certainly a lot of controversy around companies like Clearview AI, who again, the technology behind facial recognition is getting better and better. And so I worry about a world where I can't kind of track what I do in physical places. In criminal law, there are actually some expectations that follow you around 24/7 without a warrant. There's a number of Supreme Court cases about that idea. I think we need to port over some of those ideas to commercial surveillance as well, that I want to walk outside, I don't lose, or even like, in here, like if I have windows and if companies can use X-ray vision or whatever to track what I do in physical places, the technology is advancing. Companies have more and more ability to surveil. I think we need to have some protections to retain some degree of obscurity when we walk outside and not have companies track what we do all the time.
Exactly. And Meta just acquired a company called Precise. I don't know if you're familiar, it's a German company. And they can kind of tell body measurements and everything to be able to see what sizing people have. And that paired with exactly what you said, recognizing facial recognition, maybe eye tracking, and all of these things, we can really put together a strong data set. And that is a little bit scary to see, okay, where's our privacy in that? That's where the whole concept of consent comes. Where have we consented to that? And what are you going to use and do with that data?
Mm-hmm. One of the advantages and strengths of the United States is that we have 50 laboratories of invention and entrepreneurialism and creation of new products and ways of advancing law and things like privacy. And that's also our downside here, is that we have 50 states going in all these different directions. I was very encouraged when we first passed the data privacy law of a congressman from the state of Washington. Immediately filed a bill very similar to what we were doing to get that process started. But the federal process takes years and years. We did data privacy in Virginia in 2 months, maybe 2.5 months. And we started with a product that had been kind of taken out for a spin in another state, and then made sure that it was solid, and then we got it through. And I think what got it through more than anything was the fear of what it could have been. And so all of a sudden it looked pretty good to a lot of the businesses, because that's where we really had to sell it, because there's really no way of getting out to the public in any kind of meaningful way. Consumer Reports, for instance, took a look at our product and said, yeah, pretty good start, not too bad. Doesn't go far enough, but we're good with it. And after we passed the bill, when people had actually something to look at and measure, then they came out of the woodwork and saying, no, it doesn't do this and it doesn't do that, and it's got this fault and that problem. And but there's still some old-fashioned things that parents and people in charge of children. I spent my career as a juvenile probation officer, as someone who ran a juvenile detention facility in our Virginia Department of Juvenile Justice. And there are still things that parents need to do, and things that I advise parents to do, which is keep the computer where it's within sight. Don't let kids go up into their rooms and do these things. One of the advantages we've had, and it's a strange thing, but our crime rates in the United States have been dropping precipitously since 1995. And I think one of the reasons is that deviance, if you will, among teenagers has moved indoors and onto computers. You can be a dangerous, wild outlaw on the internet, so you're not out robbing houses or stealing from cars or doing other things. The problem is it's hard to detect that kind of thing, and some kids, especially kids without means, are getting caught in the same ways that kids have always been caught, because they're out on the streets and doing things because they don't have that bedroom and that private computer and what have you, and it affects poor kids and kids of color and what have you. But there are still we need to emphasize that the first line of defense in terms of, your children and their use of the internet and their data privacy is to stay on top of it and to set strong rules for this is when you get to use the computer and this is where you get to use it. You can't just go off and disappear and do whatever you want to do. We're going to control that and lessen those restrictions over time. It's the same thing as I'll make an analogy to the family car. Nobody just when a kid first gets his driver's license just hands it over and says, yeah, take it whenever you want, go wherever you want, do whatever you want. No, you don't do that. That'd be crazy. It's the same thing with the internet and with the use of those things. And I think more than anything, we need education for parents to know that there are protocols you can follow to improve the potential to minimize the potential harm that your children can get involved in with issues around data privacy and where they go on the internet. And so there's also that parallel track. Not all solutions are technological. Some of them are more based in common sense and the fact that just because you now have something that can entertain your children 24/7, that you shouldn't necessarily use that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Senator Marston. And I just wanted to wrap up with one more question for you. Are we seeing, Virginia is seen, I'm going to use it again, the beacon of truth. Virginia is seen as the forefront in terms of data privacy legislation in the United States. It's one of those states that has really been at the front of all the change. And are we looking at a more, at a less fragmented approach towards data privacy in the United States, especially since last year, I think I asked this question as well last year. Are we looking at something where, all states are going to come together and form sort of like the GDPR in Europe? Is that something that's even possible?
That is something that I think will come once more states, develop a policy, an act, if you will, similar to Virginia's. They all have minor differences, but we're starting to go in that direction that we're being copied, if you will. Mm-hmm. And
which is good.
Which is a good thing up to a point. And then after a while, you get so many different states with so many little minor nuances and differences, it becomes impossible for people to know, what's right and what's wrong in what state. And there are no digital borders, if you will, that are geographical in nature. So eventually what I'm hoping is that once we get enough states that there will be a commission formed that will start to hold meetings and send representatives to that, and that rather than having a top-down federal solution come in place, which will be a compromised mess, that we get agreed upon principles at the state level and build the system of privacy protections upward, as opposed to trying to come up with a grand compromise to push it down from the federal level. And then once we get that conglomeration of states, if you will, then at some point in time, the federal government can come in and say, hey, you guys have it just about right now and what have you, let's pass a national kind of law. That I think is probably the better approach because if Congress took it on right now and tried to come up with something, I can't even imagine the millions of dollars that are going to be spent on lobbying to turn it into something that is so compromised that it's not as effective as you would want. So let the states build it up rather than the federal government push it down.
Bottom up. All right. Thank you so much. We have run out of time, so we're a little bit over our 1 hour, but it's been a very interesting and fruitful discussion. Thank you so much, Justin, Bevan, and Dave, for all of your insights today. Really fascinating discussion, and thank you so much. So Tech That Talks is on every 2 weeks, and I hope to see you guys again.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.